On episode 158 of the Peak Performance Leadership Podcast, we speak to doctors CATHY BUSH and Tara Peters, and they're going to tell you how you can ensure that you retain your employees' motivation and pick them up when they're down. Are you ready for this? It's all about motivation today, so let's do it. Welcome one, welcome all to the Peak Performance Leadership Podcast, a weekly podcast series dedicated to helping you hit peak performance across the three domains of leadership. Those being leading yourself, leading your team, and leading your organization. This podcast couples my 20 years of military experience as a senior Canadian Army officer with world-class guests to bring you the most complete podcast of leadership going. And for more, feel free to check out our website at movingforwardleadership.com. And with that, let's get to the show. Yes, welcome one, welcome all to the Peak Performance Leadership Podcast. It is your Chief Leadership Officer, Scott McCarthy, and it's so great to have you here on the second episode since we rebranded the show to the Peak Performance Leadership Podcast. And today's topic goes directly in line with peak performance. Why? Because right now, out there, the best estimates state that nearly 70% of employees are less than enthusiastic or even committed to their work. That means they're less enthusiastic about you and your job than they are about anything else. So does that sound like peak performance to you? How about this? It's costing you between 450 and 550 billion, as in a B, that's right, $1 billion each year in demotivated employees. So if you feel like you have motivated employees who became demotivated employees, or stress that is sucking the motivation out of employees, or you want to know how to have a motivational organizational culture, or maybe you're thinking, I got conflict. That definitely saps motivation. Yes, it does, but it can also help your organization. These are the topics that we dive into today with both CATHY and Tara. So who are they? CATHY, well, she spent years, decades even, as an organizational psychologist, a consultant, professor, coach, author. She's been working all around the world in all kinds of different industries, from manufacturing to transportation, healthcare, retail, banking, etc. Meanwhile, on the other hand, we have Tara Peters, also Ph.D., and she is an educator, TED Talk speaker, author, international consultant with brands like Coca-Cola, Allstate, Walmart, for example. She is also a professional educator with over 26 years of experience. These two ladies have come together to bring you this show today, all about motivating your employees to hit peak performance, right in line with what this show is all about. So helping you as the leader to recognize demotivated employees, how to bring them back up, and how to get the most out of them. Because that is our jobs as the leaders. We are here to inspire, motivate, delegate, empower, all these great things. That's what we do. So I know you are going to enjoy it. I think that's enough for me. So why don't you sit back, relax, and enjoy my conversation with doctors CATHY BUSH and Tara Peters, all about how you can motivate the demotivated employee. Ladies, welcome to the Moving Forward Leadership Podcast. So great to have both of you here for a rare episode where I get not interview not one guest, but two. So thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having us. Yeah, we're delighted to be here.
So I gotta ask, I love getting the backstories of books, and it feels like this one has a backstory. The Demoted Employee. So right now we're recording. We're still in the mix of the pandemic, the coronavirus pandemic. But I always like to say there's also an epidemic going on with demotivated employees and people and organizations. And here I am holding your book that's addressing that exact concern. So where did this come from in the beginning, anyway?
Well, I'll get started by telling you a little bit of the story. Both Tara and I are business professors, and we worked together at Northwood University some years ago, teaching MBA classes. And the courses that we teach in particular talk a lot about organizational behavior and managing humans in the workplace. So it was really natural for people to talk to us about the challenges that they faced with that slacker employee that's a real dud. And so generally speaking, we found ourselves having a lot of conversations with people who wanted to blame people for not being as productive or motivated as they wanted them to be. And in fact, they would actually talk about how they came in motivated. I had really high hopes for them. They were really productive for a while, and then it started to drop off. And so we both spent some time talking to each other about how to help folks. And so this is a topic we've been discussing with each other for a long time. Fast forward to a point in time where I no longer worked for Northwood University, and Tara and I wanted to do a project together to stay connected with each other and to serve leaders. We have a lot of leaders in our network. And I was doing some consulting work at the time. And so we decided that we would begin to write a book. And what else would you add to the story, Tara?
So, and just really the only thing I would add to that is that we were really looking at a way to kind of the point that you were making, Scott, that this issue around demotivation is actually a really big deal. It's consequential to organizations, and we really wanted to help to close that gap. And so we were seeing so much of it that we were like, we really need to take a look at this. And so that was really our impetus for actually writing the book, and then really, digging into it in more detail to say, okay, what can we actually write about in such a way that we can actually help leaders and then ultimately help their employees around this issue that we know is really, epidemic in terms of its proportions inside of organizations. So it was an important topic to us, and it came from a place of helping, which is really central to the work that we try to do.
No, it's awesome. I was like super thrilled when I got the email to pitch, like, hey, you want to have these two ladies on your show and check out their book? I'm like, heck yes. Like, this is exactly the type of issues that I like addressing here moving forward leadership, because my show is wrapped around the premise of lead, don't boss. And it's one of those things that you've actually kind of almost directly addressed in your book. It's talking about the impacts that bosses have on organizations. And that is one of the catalysts to the demotivated employees out there. And I'll throw a little quick anecdotal story about how this even happened in my life. And I was part of a unit. So if you're unaware, by day, I'm a senior Canadian Army officer. So I served the Canadian Armed Forces, and I was in a unit, and the commanding officer that was there was great. She helped move the organization forward. She supported her people. She was doing all the great things that good leaders do. As we do in the Army, we change positions every 2 years, and a new commanding officer came in. And I thought, like, the jet was flying along, cruising along at a nice altitude, steady state. Everything was going good. New pilot came in, and we went Mach 10 nosedive, like straight down. And you talk about, you want to see increase of issues, disciplinary issues, increase of mental health issues, decrease of employee satisfaction, decrease of engagement, pick a category, right? Things went down, and a lot of things also went up. And unfortunately, it's the inverse of the direction that you normally want. So it's like, this book spoke to me.
Yeah.
It is funny to tell that story. Oh, go ahead, Scott.
No, go ahead. I'd
Yeah.
like to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I was going to say, like, your story that you just shared is like reminds me of a story that we actually tell in the book, right? So, you have a leader who was in a role, right? They were really very effective. They knew how to lead people. They knew how to engage them. They knew how to tap into their strengths. They knew how to develop them. Didn't mean that they didn't also correct them, right? Because they knew that that was a part of their responsibility. But they were really pulling on the strings that were actually motivating the employee to actually give their best effort, to bring their full selves to the work, and actually really committed to the work that was going on. And then to see what happens when you actually have a shift in leadership, and then that same employee, right, the whole direction begins to change on you, and it's actually going, in an adverse way in terms of the outcome. And so it's really interesting to kind of hear you talk about that, because, Cathy and I will say to you, we're not cynical. Okay. So we don't think that new, leader that came in, like that, he or she was standing in the bathroom in the morning, brushing their teeth going, you know what? I'm going to figure how I can mess with people today. And I'm going to figure out, how I can stick it to them. We don't come to that place. We know that there's some bad bosses out there. And so we'll leave that to the extreme. But generally, right, the overwhelming number of leaders actually want to do the work. They actually want to, support their employees. They're actually, driven by the opportunity, but they may just not have the skills that they actually need. And so we're really trying to help leaders to close that deficit and say, okay, we know that you really want to be good in terms of your role and the work that you're doing. And so let's try to help you with that. And so we're really specific about that in terms of what we offer in our research and ultimately what we wrote about.
I really wanted to reinforce also the premise that you mentioned, Scott, about lead, don't boss. And so as that relates to what we're writing about and what we're talking to people about every day, a leader is going to see a person who has a change in their behavior, a demotivation issue in some way, less productivity, more, you talked about all sorts of things, more absenteeism or other kinds of conflict going on. A leader's going to see that and say, how can I help? How can I fix this, right? A boss is probably going to go, well, let's, change some incentive systems and, put this person on a PIP or, punish them in some way, make sure that there are clear consequences and clear goals about what we expect. And these things are important, clear goals and consequences, but they shouldn't be what you start with. You should start by caring about helping people through whatever is getting in their way. And sometimes you're the thing getting in their way, again, not because we think you want to as leaders, but because sometimes you don't see the way in which your behavior is messing with other people. And so awareness and skills are the things that we're really interested in helping leaders get to.
I love what both of you finally has just said. Like I hear myself echoing here. So it makes me feel like, because both of you have PhDs and I just have a lovely couple masters. So it makes me feel like I'm actually on the right track here. So let's talk. You kind of hinted at, we hire a new employee. They show up. They're a rock star. They're giving all they got. They're making success. They're pushing the yardsticks forward. And all of a sudden, it's starts dying off. They have a bad day, and then slowly bad days turn into mediocre weeks, and like, what's going on here? So what is, how does this even transpire? How do we go from someone who is super keen, super motivated, want to do a lot of great things in the world, want to change the world, want to push that envelope, to someone showing up and punching the clock 9 to 5?
So it's a complex thing, of course, and we can't say that there's a nice and neat formula that we know every single part of the formula. But as Tara and I did our research, we began to understand that there are probably 5 major categories that we call the sources of employee demotivation. And so there are things that happen that probably are messing with the otherwise highly motivated people that are working in your group. Some of those are things they own, right? So one of the categories of the 5 is individual differences, right? So I might just be a little bit more grumpy than the average person. And so it's real easy for any bad thing to feel like a huge bad thing for me, because in my nature, I see things in a negative way. Not really, that's not true for me, but there are people like that, a little more skeptical, or, they lean a little bit more toward, being frustrated by things. And so when, bad stuff happens, which happens, they're going to get demotivated faster. That's not true for everybody. So that's only one of the 5 categories. And even that one, a leader can do a lot to help a person. The other categories are things like managing stress. And let me just pause there, because who hasn't been stressed out in 2020, right? So if you're not recognizing that just living in this weird, uncertain time is having a negative effect on your highly motivated people, right? So you need to recognize that as leaders and see what you can do to help them manage this stress, because stress steals our motivation. Just the kind of conflicts that happen in the way we interact with other people can be demotivating. I'm going along doing a great job, and then just keep running into the roadblock who never agrees with me and always wants to, get some kind of different agenda served or something. And that frustrates me, right? So that's not likely going to motivate me more when I'm dealing with that. I'll leave Tara the last 2 for you.
Yeah. And so the other piece of this, too, as well. And, one of the things that you want to think about, like in this time, you talked about, the pandemic. Well, that's caused a lot of shift, for people. And so people may be missing that interaction and just engagement that they actually had when they were actually physically in a workplace. And you can imagine if you worked in a company, and we think about the culture being really familial in nature, right? So people, they're very, they engage with one another. They have conversations with one another, little chit chat, right? I stop by your cubicle, you stop by mine, right? We check on each other, those kinds of things. And now we're not having an engagement. People may be missing that. And so culture then can begin to chip away at how people are actually, coming to work in terms of their motivational level. And then kind of to the point that we even raised earlier, it's just how you and I lead and behaviors that we engage in. And we talk about them really as failures of leadership. And so all of those things can actually impact an employee's demotivation. And so to get to your point, Scott, around a leader, well, we have to pay attention to our employees and to notice. And I know sometimes, that can be difficult because of the pressures that the leader has. They got deadlines to meet, right? They got objectives that they're trying to achieve, and they have their own stressors that they are also trying to navigate. But one of the things that's really important is for the leader to actually, make it a point to actually step back, to pay attention to what's going on with their employees, to actually notice, and then to come to it in terms of the conversation from a place of helping and supporting as opposed to blaming. Because you'd be surprised when you sit down and you talk to people and you have an interaction with them that you find out what is going on. And one of the things that I found in my own, practice as a leader is to build those relationships before something happens. So when something goes down, if you will, we already have a rapport, we already have a relationship. And when I tell the employee, right, I want to have a chat with you, it doesn't feel like they're coming to the principal's office. I used to be a principal, and I'm telling you, adults, even though they're adults, when they have to come to their boss's office, it still feels like, oh my God, I'm a kid again. And I'm taking that long walk to the principal's office. And so this is where that relationship and rapport, really comes important. And you open up the conversation, hey, Scott, I noticed there's been a change, I noticed this and this, hey, tell me what's going on, how can I help? And so that part, that relationship building becomes really important. And it's a part of what we talk about as well in the book, because this is a relationship between a leader and his or her, employees. And so that relationship is really, really important in the workplace.
And I want to say it's even more challenging and more important now if your work lives have changed, if leaders and their direct reports are not seeing each other on a day-to-day basis, maybe an extended, more virtual or work from home kind of situation. If any of that has changed, how you've built that relationship matters. And leaders tend to be maybe less connected because who wants to have yet another Zoom meeting? And so they forget how important it is for their employees to have that day-to-day interaction, to know that they're supported, to help them, untangle the messes, all of those things. And so I just wanted to say, even now, this is really, really critical for us as leaders to pay attention to.
The top is the loneliest place. Colin Powell said that once. But it doesn't have to be. Instead, you can find people to talk to, people to run ideas by, people to help you figure out solutions to the problems that you're facing right now as a leader. And see, I felt alone once, and I decided to start the podcast. And with the podcast, I decided that I needed to help people like you more. So that's why I started the Moving Forward Leadership Facebook group. Leadership skills for managers to be leaders, not bosses. You can find it at movingforwardleadership.com/group. And come join us. It's completely free for you to join us and talk leadership with us day in, day out. So check us out again at movingforwardleadership.com/group. Now back to the show. Wow, there's so much for me to unpack there. I don't even know how and where to start from. Like, there were so many great things. I loved like that whole like, I wouldn't say tirade that you two went on, but that preaching session of great leadership and great leadership principles for people to follow, you know, from checking in on your people to asking the questions before, you know, jumping to conclusions. Right. And it goes back, it reminds me when I first took command of a squadron of 200 members, and right away, my subordinates started complaining about one civilian employee we had. And I said, okay, well, let's have a conversation. But right, like as simple as a conversation. They're like, oh, you know, doesn't do his job. He doesn't do this. He doesn't do that. Blah, blah, blah. We need to figure out a way to fire him. All this other stuff. I'm like, has anyone ever talked to him to see, one, does he even know what his job is supposed to be? And two, if everything's okay? And they're like, I'm like, I'm going to take that as a no. So let's start from there before we start jumping to conclusions. Oh, lo and behold, there's some medical issues, and people haven't really given him much guidance and direction in the past, and all this other stuff. So it is such a relief to hear this, and so many people need to hear these little things, because right away, a lot of people out there, especially the leaders who are just been promoted into, you know, really leadership roles, whether that's being a manager of a team or maybe a department or something like this, and they're starting to really have a lot of impact and a lot of influence over their organization, and they just don't have the skills, whether that is from lack of training, lack of courses, education, or of lack of good mentors. And they just see the bosses out there and like, fire them. Let's get rid of them. Just as you said, Tara, you know, let's start hammering them with repercussions and all this. And that's just not a healthy work environment. That's not a healthy organizational culture. And that's definitely one of the things I want to hit on is, you know, how do we build that motivational organizational culture? Culture is so important. And it's something I talk about here at Moving Forward Leadership so much, because the culture can make or break an organization. You know, look at Uber. Uber went some serious rocky times. Why? Because of organizational culture. And I don't even know if they're out of the woodwork yet or out of the troublesome, right? Like, there's so many organizations
with their leabership, right? I mean, the tone was
exactly
right. It was toxic. You look at their former CEO and his behavior, but what he was allowed, though, he actually climbed the ranks, right? Because the whole backstory on that is some other folks actually created Uber, and then he came alongside, and you know, he had some background, and he actually becomes the CEO. But there were warning signs all along the way. But what happens in organizations sometimes is that when people produce and they get results, we overlook the warning signs. We overlook the red flags. We overlook the bad behavior, and we make excuses for it, and we allow it. And so that whole culture, it cascaded down throughout the entire, organization. And so you end up with a situation where you got a toxic environment. And so leaders, they facilitate that. And so if you want it, there's an old saying, right, that the fish rots from the head. And we talk about that many times within the context of ethics, but it also relates to culture. And so if you have a leader who, is engaging in behavior that suggests that, certain kinds of, interactions or decisions, et cetera, are okay, then that just cascades, throughout the organization. And then that becomes the culture, because people look up. to see what is appropriate and what's not. And so that then becomes, really consequential. But we talk a lot about culture in the book. Kathy, you want to jump in here on this?
Yeah, I was just thinking, actually, the idea of creating the kind of great, engaging, positive, motivating culture, it doesn't happen by accident, right? So, and it also doesn't happen because a couple of, leaders, dudes are sitting in a room with the door closed saying, what do we want it to be? It's not that intentional. Certainly Uber's wasn't that intentional. All the examples you can think of, they happen more or less organically. They certainly start, culture starts at the top, but you can be intentional. You can sit down and say to one another as leaders, what kind of culture do we respect and value? What do we want? And more importantly than anything, you should talk to the people who live in the culture. So what's working, what's not working, pay attention to what they say. Make sure that they know that you actually care what they say. So culture shouldn't be something we do unto you. But the other thing I was thinking about, Scott, I was thinking about this when you were asking the question and transitioning into culture, is that there isn't really just one kind of motivational culture. It's really a matter of fit. And so if you're a leader and you feel like the culture is really working for some people, and again, maybe we're producing great results, but we also have other kinds of employee well-being measures that tell us this is great. We have longevity, we have positive attitudes and satisfaction in the organization, but not everybody. Then you ought to pay attention to those specific folks. Is it a matter of inclusion? Do they not see themselves feel welcome within that culture? And is there something you can do for that? Is it a matter of where maybe you're a very bureaucratic culture and you need to be, I'm thinking your military experience has certainly some of that in it. Or maybe you're a very creative culture like a Google. And not everybody's going to fit each of those cultures, but a lot of people will. So look at the folks who don't fit and have an honest conversation with them. Care about that. See if there's something that might fit their preferred style of work better, because that's where motivation is going to come up. So it's really more a matching game in that case. If you feel like the culture is solid, if you're intentional about creating it and you see the culture you want, but some people are not fitting in and you see their motivation going down, I think that's the path you want to take.
Yeah, I really like that last part. Some people just don't fit the organizations, and unfortunately, they have to move on, and it's for the betterment of both the organization and the individual. But at the same time, try them out in different roles. Just because the role that they're in now, let's say they're in sales and it's just not working because they're not a good salesperson and they feel pressured to sell. Well, maybe their realm of genius is actually over marketing. Flick them over, and the subculture within the marketing department could be the right fit for them. And it's like, oh, I'm allowed to be, creative and think outside the box and not follow a script and all this stuff, which you would see in the sales department. And then they're like, okay, this company is not so bad. It's actually, the subculture of sales was not fitting with me. The subculture of marketing fits me, and the whole organizational culture actually jives with what I am. Or maybe they go there and they're like, oh, I don't like this place whatsoever. And the supervisor go, you know what? We're not really driving. Maybe it's time for you to look elsewhere. Right. But you gotta go through that process. And too often people go, all right, sorry, you're out of here. Like you're not cutting the mustard. Time for you to move on type thing. So love it. One of the things I wanted to definitely dive into was the role of conflict in organizations and how that can, cause demotivation in our employees. Try to say that 5 times fast. Demotivation in our employees, and I'm going to leave that in for fun, because conflict is energy sucking. However, at the same point, conflict is needed for growth. Without conflict, there is no growth, and without growth, the organization will eventually whittle and die. So, 1, how can we kind of balance that? And 2, how can we help remotivate our employees who, maybe there has been some serious conflict going on? in the workplace. Maybe they're feeling harassed. Maybe they feel like they're not being heard. Maybe they're feeling like, they're not being respected. All these different scenarios which could pop up. So how can we bring them up, but at the same time, instill a organization culture that enables a professional conflict, that'll enable it to grow. Whoever wants to dive in, feel free. I think, Tara, you're seeming a little bit frothy there, so I think you're going to jump first.
Okay. So, here's the thing. So conflict can be functional and dysfunctional. And so, one of the things that we know is that if we can create a culture where conflict is actually viewed as something that has utility, so it has value, it's actually useful, then we can equip employees to actually navigate that, successfully. So if we think about the importance of, having a diverse workforce, then it's inherent in that you're going to have conflict, people from different backgrounds, experiences, values. And so they're going to bring a different perspective to the decision or to the process. And so, one of the things that we want to help people with is to navigate that. And a part of that, sometimes it's trying to parse out whether or not it's just conflict around what the work is and how we're going to do it, or if it's a conflict between two people. Now, that relationship and that interpersonal piece is a little more dicey because, you're trying to get two individuals to, one, recognize that there's an issue that needs to be resolved, and then figuring out how to either help them to do that, hopefully on their own, or, bring in the manager if that becomes important. And so I think it's really important when you think about conflict, how you frame it. And we talk about that, where we like to start from the premise that conflict actually has value if we make it functional. And then the next step of that, okay, is how do we deal with the different types of conflict that are going to come up ultimately, in the workplace. And we talk about, tools to equip, leaders or employees with that. Kathy, you want to touch on that, or maybe go in another direction as well?
Absolutely. I like to say, by the way, I like that both of you were talking about what we refer to as productive conflict. I like to say that if you show me a team of 7 people who get along 100% of the time, they agree with everything that everybody says on the team, and they all do things the same way, then I will tell you have a team with 6 people too many. So you really do need the conflict. The conflict is necessary in order to not just to grow, but to create and to beat the competition, to get outside of your rut and your routine. And so those things are really, really important things for teams to get a hold of. And so you need to help people on your team see the value of that. In terms of demotivation, I want to say it's when you have people who are in task or relationship conflict. I just don't get along with that person. I can't stand being in a meeting with him. I wish he would just shut up, right? Those feelings that we have individually, that's demotivating. But it's also really demotivating for the entire rest of the team who are victims of the conflict going on in the environment. And we've all been there, right? So you as a leader have to step up. You have to set the tone. This is important. You have to help people recognize and value the differences. You have to help people figure out how to disagree effectively without getting their feelings hurt or feeling stepped on in some way, right? So all of those things are things a leader can do. And then you got to help facilitate when you notice everybody getting uncomfortable and tense. You can't walk away from it. So if you personally are just, a harmonizer and you just want everything to be lovely all the time, if that's your leadership style, you probably don't have the courage to deal with that messy stuff. And everybody needs you to. You need to step up to that. That's an important part of leading people. And certainly as we talk about motivation, keeping the motivation of the entire team as high as possible requires that you step up to those messy things.
And it's also too, like to Kathy's point, a part of that stepping up as a leader may be that you equip the people in your team to actually resolve their own issues, right? It's kind of like parents, right? And kids, we don't want to have to step, every time my brother and I got into it, my mom didn't want to have to play referee, right? So at some point you got to equip, and I know that employees aren't kids, but it's the same idea. You got to equip them to deal with their own messes so that every time something goes on, you aren't having to come in, and to play referee to have them to resolve it. Because that can be exhausting and demotivating for the leader as well. And then it can create this codependence that you don't want, in terms of your employees, where they're always looking, to Kathy, they're always looking to Tara, to come in and fix and clean up, whatever comes up. And it's like, no, you guys can actually, you can resolve that. You have the tools to be able to do that.
No, absolutely, and I actually enjoy the kid analogy. Not to be disrespectful, however, as a parent of two young boys, I do find many of the principles are very similar. The principles are very similar. Now, obviously, my subordinates are not children, but the principle is the same. And you let people know what you expect of them. I do that with my children all the time. Like, no, I expect you to clean up after yourselves. I expect you to, pick up your toys, all these things. Well, I expect you to show up to work on time. I expect you to have these types of results. I expect you to act in this type of way. Principle is exactly the same, right? So I actually enjoy that analogy.
I do as well, Scott. Like, you know what? Actually, sorry to cut you off, but I wanted to reinforce for anybody listening to this thinking, oh, that's offensive. I feel the opposite. Like, I love my children. I care very much about them. If I care about my subordinates as much as I care about the happiness and well-being of my children, that's a wonderful thing, right? And so right. I think it's a nice analogy. It means I care about you.
No, for sure. Now, one thing that was kind of brewing in back of my head, we were talking about the whole conflict thing, and it was kind of as a leader, not up on your pedestal or anything, but sitting in the higher of the level of the organization, looking down at subordinates and them having that conflict. What happens if you're the one that has the conflict with one of your subordinates? And he's like, right, like, obviously that's going to kind of be demotivating. It's going to be motivating for both of us, because like, here comes Doug again. I gotta, and the same time, Doug's like, gotta do that walk to the hallway again. And no one's happy, and work, it's not productive. It can boil over, because all of a sudden you got the peers of Doug, snickering behind Doug's back going, Doug's off to see the boss. He's not going to get the promotion later, or he's not going to get the, the Gucci assignments or whatever. And it's not good for anyone. So if leaders are realizing, as I'm saying this, like, ooh, am I in that situation? I think I might be in that situation. What can they do to try to get themselves out of it?
Well, I'll get started on this, Tara. I'd love your thoughts as well. So I'm thinking that, if you are leading people and where you have that good chemistry, that easy interaction, those relationships that are really clicking, doing well, and the ones that are harder, they have more challenge in it. You know where all of those are. And first of all, you have a responsibility as a leader of people to care about all of those equally. So the ones that are working, you should still be nurturing that. The ones that might need some work, you need to nurture that. And I think in either case, as a leader, you need to be having conversations. So it's not just you responsible for the relationship, but it's you and Doug talking to each other about, hey, what are the things we need to work on in order to make sure we're communicating effectively? How am I doing meeting your needs? Is there anything else I can be doing differently? That's a two-way street. But if you're Doug's leader in that situation, you start with the invitation. I'd love your feedback. I'd love to know what I could do differently. And likely Doug will also say, well, what's going on that I could work on as well, because you're building a relationship. Like every relationship that matters, you have to invest in it. You have to spend some time, and you have to understand what's not working. It's not enough just because you might decide you don't like them, or there's some specific form of conflict, may have a long-term history, who knows? But it is not okay if you're their leader. You have a responsibility. You can't just walk away. You can't just write them off. It's inappropriate as a leader to do that. Maybe as a coworker, you can just say, I'll avoid working with Doug. But as their leader, you have a responsibility to build that relationship. What do you think, Tara?
And the thing I'll say here is that as a leader, you have to be careful here by not addressing it, because there's this, you'll inadvertently create in groups and out groups. in your department, which is not a good thing. And what'll happen is that Doug will end up in the out group, right? And then, so he's an outsider, and, again, people will pick up on that, and they'll know that, you don't really care for Doug, you don't really like him. And then he will be treated accordingly, or people will talk about him in ways that reflect that. And that's not really healthy, because other people see that. And then the other piece of that is then they begin to wonder, could that become me? Right. So today, I'm getting along with you, we have a good relationship, but I see how you're treating Doug. And then I wonder, if I'll be next. And so it gets to the point where Cathy was talking about, where we have to equip leaders to be able to deal with the messy things. And this is a part of the messy stuff. This is the managing part of leading, which means that you got to get in there, with your hands, maybe your feet too, and you got to deal with this, messy situation that looks like sausage making. And a part of that requires you to actually initiate it. And one of the things I would say to you is, if you're having that, interaction, that relationship with Doug, is to go to Doug's turf. And so I would go to Doug's office. I would go to his workstation. I would say, hey, Doug, I'd like to chat with you just later today, carve out some time, maybe 15, 20 minutes. And so trying to break down some of the barriers that might be contributing to the conflict, and then trying to open up the dialogue. And so I think in my own professional experience, that's been very helpful in terms of resolving issues, because sometimes it's a misunderstanding. And, so it got conflated, and it went from this to that, to that, to that. And suddenly, something really small, became something much more significant. And then sometimes, the issue may be something that the two of you cannot resolve. And so it may require some escalation. And so, again, this is where, you and I, when I say you and I, we're the manager has to figure out in relation to Doug, like where we are in terms of that, and then take, the appropriate, steps as a result. So it just depends. And this is where there's the nuance that you're going to have to navigate in your role. And we often talk to students about this. You're going to read about leading and leadership in your program, but see, this doesn't have a multiple choice answer at the end. This is where your experience, your wisdom, all of that's going to come to bear. And one of the things that I might do, even before I went to approach Doug, is to talk to a mentor. I'd have a sounding board. And so in my case, that could be with Cathy, that could be with my mom. And I'll say, look, I got this situation. And then sometimes just talking that through becomes really helpful. And, you have some light bulb moments, and you're like, okay, this is how I can actually approach, the situation. So again, there's some nuance to it. And sometimes it works, Scott, to be honest, and then sometimes, well, it's like the Cowboys.
This year's
that too. So.
The audience is wondering what the heck she's talking about. Cowboys.
Yeah, Dallas Cowboys.
We're joking around about sports before I hit record. So she's talking about the Dallas Cowboys national football team. Cathy's shaking her head.
Yeah. That's not.
Oh, that's hilarious! What a way to wrap up that with a sports reference. I've been loving this. But it's funny, you were talking about how the different things you basically lecture on as a professor for the students and stuff. And what I was thinking was, there's not necessarily a right way to do something, but there's many wrong ways to do something too. So it's a very fine line, especially in tricky situations like that, where we are having such deep interpersonal conflicts with individuals, where two individuals, whether that's subordinates of ours or maybe coworkers from different departments, who knows, are having conflicts like this. But you're right, we just can't let it go unchecked. And that's what's going to, wrapping right back to this whole conversation of, it's going to affect our organizational culture. It's going to break down our teams. And here I'm all about helping leaders develop and support high performing teams. It's going to become a demotivational factor for individuals, because they're like, oh, I'm stuck in this place where all suddenly now it's no longer about, us. It's all about me. and everyone's stabbing each other in the back. I don't want to be here. Oh, I'm looking at job offers elsewhere and I don't care anymore. And then suddenly it goes back to the leader leading themselves because they're stressed out because productivity's dropped, plummeted. They're realizing their organizational culture is in the toilet and they're having all these problems. So it's so crucial to not sit back, accept the mediocrity of, oh, it'll just work itself out. But at the same time, respecting what you said earlier, Tara, that sometimes they do need to work it out, but you have to recognize kind of that trigger point where you need to step in as the leader. So great stuff, ladies. Great stuff. We're going to wind down here at the show now. It's flown by crazy. And we could keep talking about this topic, I know, for hours. But before we wrap up, I do got a couple of last questions for both of you. The first is a question I asked all the guests here at Moving Forward Leadership. So I'm going to ask both of you for your own answers. First, I'll kick off with Tara, and then I'll go to Cathy. So Tara and Cathy, according to you both, what makes a great leader?
So I think the first thing that makes a great leader is self-awareness. And so I think that each of us has to know ourselves fully. And so that means understanding where our strengths lie and also knowing where our gaps are. And so I think starting with that premise then opens us up to growing and developing and caring about other people. But I think that self-awareness is really critical for leaders. It keeps you from, there's the saying, the emperor has no clothes. It can help you to avoid that scenario because you are actually aware and where you're actually good at things and where, again, you maybe need to defer to others. And so I would start that with that particular skill or attribute being really important in terms of a leader.
And I would add that leadership is really determined by followership. And so whether or not you have a title, and oftentimes without the title, we see amazing leadership. So great leadership is, again, determined by whether or not people feel led. That comes down to, do they feel like you're there for them? Do you care about them? Are you invested in their success? And so lots of people aspire to be great leaders, and they spend quite a lot of time pounding on their own chest and waving their hands around, sort of the general equivalent of, look at me, look at me. And you might even look pretty polished and attractive. It might be a shiny star, but if you don't care about people, it's going to be a shooting star. It's not going to last very long. It'll fade out quickly. So you really need to care about them. Leading is about them, not you.
Fantastic. Both answers. Fantastic. And finally, how can people reach out to you both? How can they find you? How can they be part of your journeys? The book, where can they find it? We'll kick off with Cathy. We'll go inverse order. So Cathy, then Tara, we'll wrap up with.
All right. Yeah. So we work together also as consultants. I started by saying we came together as business professors and friends who wrote a book, but we work together as consultants. We call ourselves the Leadership Doctors. We are mostly invested in helping leaders and leadership teams have a look at their organizational culture. And you can find out a whole lot more about what we do and how we might help you through our website and connecting with us that way. So it's theleadershipdoctors.com.
And then you can also connect with us on LinkedIn. So I know that Scott will have all our information, but it's Tara Peters and it's CATHY BUSH. We both are Ph.D, so it'll be easy to find on LinkedIn. So you can follow us on LinkedIn. And so we would love to connect with you there. We share, we have a new segment. We started 2 Minutes with the Leadership Doctor. So we're sharing weekly insights for leaders. So there's lots of really good information and just us really trying to be helpful to those who are aspiring to be leaders, as Cathy alluded to, or those who are in leadership positions and are looking to develop themselves further.
Awesome. And as the ladies mentioned, I will have the links in the show notes. If you go to movingforwardleadership.com/158, links in the show notes. Ladies, thank you. Thank you for your time. Thank you for a copy of the book. It was a fantastic read, one that I will hold on to for the near future, most definitely. I don't keep them all the books I get, but this one I definitely will. So thank you so much for coming out.
Appreciate the opportunity to chat with you.
And that's a wrap for this episode, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for listening. Thank you for supporting the Peak Performance Leadership Podcast. But you know what you could do to truly support the podcast? And no, that's not leaving a rating and review. It's simply helping a friend. And that is helping a friend by sharing this episode with them if you think this would resonate with them and help them elevate their performance level, whether that's within themselves, their teams, or their organization. So do that. Help me, help a friend, win-win all around. And hey, you look like a great friend at the same time. So just hit that little share button on your app, and then feel free to fire this episode to anyone that you feel would benefit from it. Finally, there's always more. There's always more lessons around being the highest performing leader that you can possibly be, whether that's for yourself, your team, or your organization. So why don't you subscribe? Subscribe to the show via movingforwardleadership.com/subscribe. And until next time, lead, don't boss, and thanks for coming out. Take care now.